No mai haere mai, my name is Jeremy and this is the Maxim Institute podcast. Today I'm sitting here with Julian Wood, our senior researcher at Maxim Institute, to dig into the ideas and issues that sit behind the last 4 years of what he's been doing here as a researcher. Coming into Maxim Institute after long stints working as an economist in the Department of Labour during the Clark government, and then working on a business in rural China, Julian is our resident, prophet of doom, I would say. I would say that because he has a knack for starting to think and work on things that are about to explode into major national political issues within about 6 months to 12 months. Whether it's news stories about the housing crisis, charging a tourist tax to pay for infrastructure in our regions, or concerns about the affordability of New Zealand's super and talkback chatter about immigration, Julian's work over the last 4 years has sat at the intersection of some of the most difficult, long-term problems that occupy our national consciousness. So Julian, welcome. What does it feel like to be a harbinger of doom?
I actually really enjoy it personally.
What is it they say about economists?
Well, it depends entirely. If you're talking about econometrics, then I would say the two key terms there are con and tricks.
I've heard that economics is the dismal science.
It is the dismal science, yes. Yeah. It's very hard
Hence the gloom.
Yes, yeah. I had a professor once that had a newspaper that said "Good times ahead," says economists, and I think it's the only time in his career he'd seen an economist saying such a thing. So, yes. Yeah.
Well, last month we released your fourth research paper, A Welcome That Works, which looks specifically at New Zealand's migration settings. But I kind of want to start back a little bit when you first joined us as an economics researcher. Can you tell us a little bit about the work that you started then, which led to your first paper, Growing Beyond Growth, looking at regional development? Why it was that Maxim Institute, and you particularly, started investing in these ideas of regional development?
Yeah, I mean, I think Maxim had been on a journey there where place was becoming more important, and there was a sense that actually in the national dialogue we had moved into net benefit arguments and the big picture, but we're forgetting or starting to...
Okay, hold on. I'm going to perform a little role of being a translator here, or demanding translation. When you say more concern with place and, would you say net benefit arguments?
Yeah.
So can you just unravel that a little bit?
Regional development is about, I'm going to use another word, spatial impacts. So this is the impact that a national level policy can have differently in different places. So migration rules, for example, why don't we get concrete? So I think New Zealand's the only country in the world where migration has led the Reserve Bank to adjust its interest rate or the official cash rate.
Right.
Simply because what was going on in Auckland meant that the overall economy was overheating, but people in the South Island weren't experiencing that growth, but now were facing a higher interest rate because of what was going on in Auckland. So there was this national decision that was at a national level, but was being felt very differently in different parts of the country. And that's, I think, something that Maxim was starting to catch on to, that actually we need a way of understanding the local story a bit better.
Tapping into the idea that there is a New Zealand economy, but actually there's also a Dargaville economy, and there's a Christchurch economy, and an Auckland economy, and even in some ways there's a Remuera economy and a Drury economy. Yeah,
and so the way we design our policy is often at that centralised Wellington level, and we're aiming for the national good.
Looking at averages
across the country, when actually they can be experienced in very different ways in very different locations.
And so when you started looking at regional development, and as an economist, how do we actually do right by all parts of New Zealand so that people in all parts of New Zealand can actually have a chance at a good life and flourishing and succeeding? And not just people, but also towns, like the different places in New Zealand. And I guess I've heard you talk before about how the Māori connection to place is actually quite a distinguishing feature of New Zealand, and one that probably needs to have a bit more role in our conversations around whether or not we let places die, for instance.
Yeah, and there's some really good New Zealand research out there on this, and too often we hear this average story that the average Māori person looks like the average non-Māori when it comes to mobility, for example, how they move around for jobs and things like that. When you dig into that, the research in New Zealand basically says, well, actually no, that's more nuanced than that. If a Māori person is living outside of its iwi or hapu grouping, they're actually way more mobile than the average New Zealander. But as soon as they are then centred or come back to their community and reside in their sort of ancestral home, they're a lot more sticky. So there's these nuanced stories that lie behind the average that we start to need to unpick if we're going to understand the good life in a particular place.
Yeah, because I think good is a really key word to get there, because actually there is a good for someone to be found in the home of their culture and in the home of their ancestors. And it is, like if you think about it in terms of a typical kind of economic view of, labour movements, and hey, if there's not a job where you are, then you should probably move to a place where there is jobs. And so, and you almost view it as like, as long as you can get a house and your family can move with you and you can find a good school, then that's fine. Like, you should just go to where the job is. But actually, having an understanding of what that sort of cultural displacement, and I think we've seen it in terms of the movement of many Māori to urban locations. What was in the 50s and 60s, 70s?
Yeah.
The loss and what has happened since then for Māori, the loss of language and loss of connection to family, and in many ways purpose as well. What's it been like, I guess, getting into that as an economist and having to kind of make arguments around, well, actually, we should be respecting this?
Yeah, it's an interesting debate to get into, because the classic standard economic argument is typically built around mobility, that labour is mobile and should move to where the opportunities are. That serves you at one level, it serves you very well, and you can see how efficient that solution might be from a mathematical perspective. But we have to remember that people's lives are far deeper than sort of just the economic. There are the social and cultural aspects to our lives which are fundamentally important. And that if you're having trouble connecting with this, another way to think about it is how many people move overseas for jobs. But when they start to raise their family, what do? A lot of them return back to New Zealand at that stage. Why? Because there is something inherently beautiful and good about your history and the way you were raised, and you want to replicate that within your family. And so there is this global story which actually replicates sort of a national story in some respects, that there is a beauty to be found in location and place. Unpicking that, typically economists will sort of decamp into two sides, one which is spatial and one which is this more classic story. The thing that I found really interesting in that is even people who advocate for the spatial know and understand the risks of that type of policy. It is a high risk type of policy to start.
Sorry, and by spatial, advocating for spatial, you mean?
Different policies for different places.
Right.
So finding a local solution to a local problem and saying, hey, actually, if we're going to make this local story important, we need to find a different type of solution. You immediately start to get into high risk and often political or politically motivated spending on behalf of the government. And we've seen that throughout New Zealand's history, right? It's not a current. This is not. I'm gonna keep going here for a little bit if you'll give me license. Just there is this notion with the Provincial Growth Fund, for example, that this is a political spend, and I would say yes, there are great risks around that. But equally, you can look back into the 1970s in New Zealand, and you would say, hey, what was the economic argument for Marsden B up north? It was a similar. Yeah, well, it's that entire story sort of being repeated in New Zealand, that actually as soon as you start to dive into policy or spending money in a particular place, you really have to constrain that political spend, because that is the most high risk element of it.
I'm assuming by constrain you don't mean just constrain it for the sake of constraining it, but constrain it with parameters that dictate what a good spend is, that's not just in the hands of the politicians who are wanting to make that
spend. I mean, you don't want to do this so that you win an election, basically. If you're spending money to win an election, then that's just going to give poor outcomes for everybody. If you are then removing that element, and you'll never remove it entirely, because a lot of this, I mean, the budget is a political spend, right? There's always an ability to move things the way you want to.
And also the thing is that every party hopefully has an ideological view of what the good life could look like. And so therefore, when they make decisions in the budget, it's telling you what they value. And so a sense of it is advertising their own ideological kind of, it's like, hey, we believe in this, so therefore we're going to put more money behind it. And then voters can judge. But I think what you're more digging into is specific, like, hey, I'm the MP for this area, and I'm going to make sure that there's a huge amount of money that flows from the government into this area, so I can prove to all these voters that if they vote for me, I'll give them,
Yeah, and often money, or just an influx of money, is not the right solution. So, I mean, sugar A sugar hit always tastes nice, but it doesn't have a long-lasting effect. And so you do see this well-designed policy would have clear goals and objectives, and that wouldn't mean that a community that doesn't have an option to get funding, and it wouldn't mean that a politician can't flavour that funding, but it is constraining it in some way, shape and form, just saying, hey, here's our long-term goal here, here's what we're trying to achieve, we think it's a viable spend. And you see quite a lot of this actually with, I'm sure that the Provincial Growth Fund is oversubscribed, for example. We know that for a fact that they have $3 billion, and if every application was approved, you'd probably spend $45 billion. So there is this sorting process, this way of ensuring that there is some good spend. The sad part of that, though, I would say, and this is where the doom monger sort of comes out of it, is there should be an evaluation of this spend. And I argued strongly, for example, that if you're going to put aside $10 million into something, $2 million of that really should be evaluation. And that seems an outrageous amount of money. But what that $2 million spend does is it ensures that is actually an effective spend.
Long term.
Long term, and it can effectively free up some of that money if you're finding that it's not working.
I definitely want to get back to the Provincial Growth Fund, but before we do, I kind of want to peel back to when you started in regional development, obviously coming back from China, coming back to New Zealand, starting to look at what was actually going on in New Zealand. Were there things that shocked you? What were the things that immediately popped up for you as like, whoa, we need to talk about this as a country? Yeah,
that's really interesting actually, because I came back and I did a lot of research, and I'd worked on regional development sort of 20 years previously in the Department of Labour, looking at forestry issues on the East Coast. So sort of aware of, regional development, and did this wonderful document, and we took it down and we started sharing that document with some government officials and some researchers in Wellington, and they all said, hey, this is fantastic work, but you kind of missed the whole point, which is context. And this is why the local and living somewhere is important to understanding context, because as soon as they kind of said, what are you thinking about the aging population and regional stagnation and decline when it came to population, I was like, actually that is an important issue that we need to get into. And so we basically went away and repurposed the entire framing of that paper around this singular issue, which actually I think is one of the biggest driving forces. Sort of like it's a wave that is heading towards New Zealand, and we need to be starting to move towards understanding that wave, and then also how we're going to swim through that wave, because it will happen.
Can you describe that wave in more detail?
Yeah, so at the moment most regions are growing, their populations are still growing. Although when you unpick that growth a little bit, what you see is you actually see an aging population, so that the median age of the population is getting older. And then if you jump out 30 years, what you see is actually that growth is starting to either stop, the raw numbers in your community will kind of stagnate, and some of them will start to decline as your rate of mortality is higher than your birth rate, for example, and migration, which is also in there, is not keeping up with that shift in birth versus death. So you'll see, roughly 75% of area units in New Zealand, which is sort of a geographic aggregation, you'll see that they enter into a period where they're not growing, they're actually stagnating or declining. And their median age will be rising. So the worst case scenario is Thames Coromandel, where the median age will be 65 years old.
Wow.
So the most common person you bump into on the street will be 65 years old. And that's a really important thing to understand. How do you pay for your pipes that need replacing when everybody now is on superannuation? A proportion of your over 65s, and a very high proportion in New Zealand, still work, but they don't work full time. So there's this whole...
And they're not going to be working for much longer.
Yeah. So how do we maintain a community which is now much older than it is, and also not growing population-wise? The regions that are growing are the big cities, your Auckland, your Christchurch, your Tauranga, Wellington.
Yeah, well, I remember the day that we were about to release the paper, and you sort of came to me very excitedly with this piece of paper with 2 maps of New Zealand that you'd sort of gone loose on with a pink pen, and you'd sort of gone, well, this is New Zealand right now, and it was a map of New Zealand with a couple of spots of pink on it, and these are the territorial areas that are currently in population stagnation or decline, and then you're like, and this is New Zealand in, I think it was 40 years.
Yeah.
And it was just New Zealand bright pink except for Christchurch, an area around Wellington, an area around Tauranga, Hamilton and Auckland.
Yeah.
And
Queenstown.
And Queenstown, yeah. And everything else. So the golden triangle between Auckland and Waikato and Tauranga.
Yeah.
And then everything else was pink. And it was just like, and from then on, it was the pink map of doom.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's quite a transformational moment for me, actually, was seeing that. And the great thing here is actually other countries are ahead of us. So if you look at Japan, you look at Italy, for example, a number of other countries are already experiencing this. And you are seeing something that we haven't faced yet in New Zealand, really, which is just, decline and towns closing and ending and being no more. And, a sort of a classic economics argument there as well, just let it die. Just this is natural, this should happen. There will always be a measure of that. And the other argument that we get to is, well, your predictions are just wrong, that's not going to happen here.
We're going to suddenly have a baby boom.
Or, we're wonderful, lots of people will want to come and shift here, and there's always this measure of, I would say, stubbornness maybe. Actually, we don't like change at one level, especially when that change or that prediction is saying bad things are going to happen. We fight back. And I'd say actually harness that. That's actually useful energy for your community. But look at the reality of that and say, well, hey, it's not looking good, so how can we be the very best community in decline that we can be?
Yeah, because I want to dig into that a little bit, because I think that's, as for me doing comms, like I just imagine if I was, working with someone who was running for mayor of some small town, and he or she was going up for re-election, standing up on the thing and being like, Taupo, vote for me, we'll decline well together. I mean, like, how do you
together forward to doom?
I mean, we love growth for whatever it is. We do live in a consumer society. We live in a society that's been shaped by capital ideas of profit and growth, and it's very difficult to create a positive message that doesn't include growth. And that's why the title of your first paper was Growing Beyond Growth. How do we actually stay healthy and keep growing in different ways in our communities when the population itself is declining?
Yeah, and population decline is not a predictor of health in a community. I mean, let's reframe it a little bit, because I like this area. Let's talk about pipes, though, because pipes is equally unsexy. Like, you never get a person sitting up and saying, hey, vote for me and I'll fix all our pipes.
That you didn't even know were a problem.
Yeah, but look what's happened in Wellington, right? We're now seeing sludge and all sorts of things being swept out into the sea because we haven't maintained what's underneath. We haven't maintained the very things that actually enable us to be healthy. Because they're just not sexy. No one wants to talk about pipes, but actually...
Also, we just assume that it will be taken care of by virtue of it's their job.
It's always worked. We've always had growth. We've always had lots of babies. We've always had... But in actual fact, sort of this creep, or the pipes are deteriorating underneath our feet. We just don't know it. And you can become equally sort of have the veil pulled over your eyes when it comes to population and population growth and things like that. Just because you have always been in a phase of growth doesn't mean that will continue.
Okay, so I'm living in a small town in New Zealand, and I want to keep living there. I want my family to keep living there. What do you I come to you, what do I try and hold my local representatives to account for? What are the things that I should be looking for that they are actively doing now to prepare for the future?
Yeah, I mean, certainly have a look at their long-term planning, and this is something we argued for, a sort of an extension of long-term planning, that your long-term plan shouldn't be 5 years or 10 years. You should be looking 50 years ahead. And then I would say, how are you pivoting towards an aging population? Or how are you pivoting your sort of infrastructure towards what could be in the future? So I'll give you an example. A small town might have 3 schools, all of which are sort of starting to struggle with their roles. And this is incredibly difficult to do because everybody loves their local school. But if you dig a little bit deeper, you might find that those 3 schools each have a school pool. And they're spending a lot of money maintaining 3 school pools. Might it not be better for the community to say, hey, well, we love our schools. We don't need to close them right now. We're not talking about closure, but what would make that school better, and how could it spend its budget better? Well, maybe we have one really good pool, and that frees up the extra money that the 2 schools are spending on their pool, and start investing in something else. It's about freeing up resources by creating something better. Yeah, so it's that sort of the status quo is not enough. It's time actually to start being creative. You see this overseas. In China, for example, they would have playgrounds built for elderly people. And I have never actually seen a playground built for elderly people in New Zealand, but it's literally just public use.
Very slow swings.
It is, yeah. It's gentle mobility assistance. Tauranga is pivoting a little bit towards this. You know, they've created that boardwalk along the waterfront that everybody likes. Mm-hmm. Why are they doing that? Well, part of that actually is that it's much easier for elderly people to walk along a boardwalk than sand.
Yeah.
You know, there's less injuries, less falls. It means you can enjoy that view for longer. It's wheelchair friendly. It kind of makes sense, but it is once again thinking about things creatively, because often the push is, well, we need a playground. Well, actually, you might not need a playground for kids. You might need a playground for your 60-year-olds.
Or not, even if it's not a playground, areas where people can actually come, enjoy, socialise, be together, which adds to the life of what's going on
and
makes the community a more desirable place, so that more people don't leave.
Yeah. Well, and part of it is that return migration actually as well. That, you know, what makes a healthy community over time is community itself. So try and focus on building that as much as possible, and don't try always maintaining what you've got. Change, and it's that moving beyond this sort of growth narrative. We often love growth narrative. Or let's have a subdivision. A subdivision is a great solution because it creates wealth,
and it's easy.
It's easy. It's a positive message. What you might actually need to do is say, actually, we don't want to have any more subdivisions
on the outskirts of town.
But what we need to do is rebuild what we've got in the centre of the city.
Yeah, and repurpose.
Yeah, so it's that sense of, I mean, overseas, what you've seen is people where an area has started to go into decline, and buildings have grown increasingly decrepit, and they look awful. They're no longer safe, and so the solution is just to pull them down. And that is one solution that we have seen around the world. But what do you do with that space now? And you know, sometimes you say, well, actually, we don't need a new development. What we need people to start developing these spaces inside our cities.
Yeah, well, you see that, like, you've got cities around New Zealand or towns around New Zealand where you'll often see there being a big box retail development just outside the city, and then over time, as you get a big box retail development, because all of the retailers love the extra space to be able to have a big new store that doesn't have to fit within the constraints of what's there, and then you'll have a subdivision that grows next to it, and before long, the entire sort of gravity of the town has actually moved out towards this new space. And I remember you talking quite specifically about kind of the banning of greenfields developments in small towns like, say, Greymouth, and actually saying, no, if you want to, we would love you to come into our town and to set up shop. And actually, if you won't do it in the city or in the central part of town because it's too expensive, then how can we possibly incentivize or give you a heritage grant to use an existing building and modify it or work around it?
I mean, they're incredibly complex issues when you start talking about specifics, but it's also where the gold starts to come. I do think that one of the risks of sort of this ever thinking of growth is that what you do see is you see pockets of deprivation appearing. So if you create something new that's flash and better over there, often what you see, especially overseas, we've seen in America, we've seen this where, and often in America, I hate to say it, but a little bit of white flight, people with a little bit more income start to move into that new area, and what you see is you see pockets of deprivation occurring where people who can't afford to move stay. And then people who can't afford to be somewhere else start to move in. And now you've immediately created sort of a circumstance, I think, within your community that is not fruitful for long-term.
Oh, I mean, I think the perfect example of that is Detroit. I mean, my dad grew up in Detroit. Basically, you had the situation where it was an incredible, I mean, you had the race riots in 1960s in the center of the city. And that was also, ground zero for the highways of America. The big three automobile companies in Detroit were incentivizing and lobbying government to create all these new highways so that people would buy cars to drive on them. And of course, highways that go directly into the heart of the city mean that people can take the car directly out of the heart of the city into the suburbs. And so over the course of 40 years, the complete, I mean, there was a lot to do with the local government and stuff like that as well, but just where Detroit got to in the in the early 2000s through to now, it's starting to rejuvenate. But yeah, the city council just was not able to afford to run a city of that size when there weren't people who were actually earning money, paying taxes, paying rates, all that sort of stuff. And it is this sort of, it can get to this post-apocalyptic thing, and seeing it on a city scale really demonstrates the core of the problem.
Yeah, and the solutions though are quite problematic, because there's solutions which sort of then easily spring to mind. And so what we've actually seen in England, for example, is with inner city areas that were quite depressed, you saw that was a cheaper place to live, and you saw communities inhabiting those spaces. And a way of sort of rejuvenating that was a huge amount of government subsidies went into rejuvenation, which unfortunately was then captured by those people. And rather than saying, hey, that money, what's the goal of this money, is to rejuvenate, that money was actually captured by a lot of those people. And then as property prices rose, they wouldn't let poorer people back in. And so there's this sort of thing where, and I'll come back to that, so there is this need to say, what's the goals and objectives of what we're trying to achieve? And often it's easy for that spatial or that type of policy to be captured by people, be it politicians or people in communities that are now having a lot of money spent in that community in sort of rejuvenation efforts. You always have to say, well, who captures that money over time, and how do we constrain that capture, be it political or individual? So in those cases, for example, those areas are heavily gentrified now, and that sort of sense of the local and has kind of disappeared as property prices have risen. And a lot of that is simply because public money was spent. When you do spatial policy, when you allow for policy nuance, you really have to be very careful, because even advocates, I would say I'm an advocate for spatial policy. There are a lot of risks around this that actually we spend a lot of public money and it just simply gets captured and wasted.
Well, I mean, and I think that moves perfectly into your second paper, which was a year after Growing Beyond Growth, which was taking the right risks and saying essentially that, actually, and it used a quote from Shane Jones then, and he said, yeah, like, it's a bloody big risk. Yeah, we agree, it is a big risk, but actually doing nothing and not spending money and not saying that there is a challenge here that requires a lot of investment to make sure that we don't just end up with a bunch of dead communities. And I think, one of the things that you had said quite early on that really captured me was that, the thing is that the people who can afford to move out of these places do, and the people who can't afford to move out of these places don't, and then their lives just get worse and worse and worse, and things get more and more desperate. And actually, as a society that, we should, as New Zealanders, we sort of do have the sense of, we want a fair go for everyone. And actually thinking about regional development in this way and spatial policy in this way is going, how can these places still thrive? Even if I don't live there, I want to make sure that, a child growing up in, I don't want to name a town no, to be prejudicial, but a child growing up in a small town in New Zealand, and we've seen stories like this where you've got, there was a series on midwives that was done last year, and, talking about midwives on the East Coast that, there's one midwife serving an entire, and, at that time my wife was pregnant and we were meeting regularly with our midwife, and I was just like, I can't imagine, bringing a child into the world and feeling so vulnerable, and feeling like if this one midwife was off sick, or if she was dealing with another child, 20, 30 kilometers away, that we were just on our own. This is the human element and the human cost to not investing and not caring and not taking risks.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've really hit the nail on the head, and especially for me, it's about equality of opportunity, and more so for children. So, a parent deciding not to shift, making a choice to stay in a community, sometimes there will be consequences for that, and there will be a measure of having to live with your choices. However, children growing up in that situation, they didn't have a choice, and they're now in a small town. Their education should not be, their opportunities around education shouldn't be less necessarily. There should be a sort of a minimum standard that we're saying, hey, below this is just not good enough. And actually, if that means we have to invest a bit more, and you do see a measure of this starting to creep into government policy. So one thing I was encouraged about was when it came to health funding, for example, they divvy up the HB health funding according to this really complicated formula. And it's only in the last sort of few years where they've started to include the age of your population as one of the variables that influences that. So we know that as people age, they experience more healthcare costs. So if your average age of your community was older, that wasn't being taken into account previously, and now it is. But there's something there around, education funding. Every child gets the same amount of funding, and then they have some top-ups and things like that. I think we need to start thinking about the spatial effects of that actually educating someone in the middle of, on the East Coast, for example, that there might be some more inherent costs that we just have to say as a society we're willing to pay. Because if we don't, you will just see this growth in NEETs, people who are not in education, employment or training. And you see quite a high correlation, for example, in the rate of NEETs and overall, regional disadvantage. You are seeing children everywhere are not the same. The opportunities that they have everywhere are not the same. And you'll never get equality of outcomes. But you can say, hey, let's focus on opportunity, equality of opportunities, that some of these places will just have to think differently. In Auckland, for example, not every school has a pool. Often a school will say, well, we're going to send our kids to the local pool, council pool. They all get in a bus and they drive for half an hour to get to the school pool. And then they all get on the bus and they go back again. A rural community might not have a local school pool, but they might have a local council pool. And saying to a school, hey, the way you've been thinking about education and the way you're spending your money might need to change, simply to get a better outcome. And that might mean rethinking the way you fund things.
After taking the right risks, what happened is obviously in the middle of all of your research on this, the Provincial Growth Fund was announced, and that there was $3 billion on the table for the regions to actually have some smart, hopefully some smart investments to actually spur growth in the regions. And the next paper you delivered was A Risk Worth Taking, which was an analysis of the first year of the operation of the Provincial Growth Fund to sort of check, how is this going? How is this spend? What is the rubric for deciding how this money is being spent? It would be good just to hear a little bit, because I know that what you said at the beginning about, untargeted money that is not necessarily being spent with an understanding of what the long-term goals of development and what could be successful. Can you give us just a brief rundown of where you think the Provincial Growth Fund has been and where you think it needs to be improved?
Yeah, I was incredibly, would I say surprised? Not entirely surprised that the Provincial Growth Fund happened. We've seen similar schemes overseas. So when it was announced, I think it's a good move. I actually support the idea of a Provincial Growth Fund. Would I call it a growth fund? Not necessarily. Maybe a transition fund for some. But in essence, I think, is it a good idea? Probably yes, it's a good idea to take some risks. The focus on growth and this ever, how many jobs are we going to get for this money might be the wrong rubric. The other thing I think is that there's this constraining the 3-year political cycle. This is a 3-year tranche of money that has to be spent within 3 years, and we want our outcomes and goals to be within these 3 years. Actually, I think that's sort of the wrong focus. And how would I reframe it? Well, I would say forget 3 years, for example. $3 billion is great, but don't stress about spending that in 3 years. Allocate the funding maybe over 5 or 6 or 7 years. Once again, I just think it's better to do something right than just to spend money.
Yeah, because I remember at the end of the first year, there was a lot of kind of sniffy coverage about it, basically being like, how much money's been spent and how many jobs have been created. Well, and look at how many of those jobs are just Wellington bureaucrats.
So in some respects, I would say that is kind of poor analysis, because what are you trying to achieve with this? We're not trying to achieve immediate change. It also highlights something that I think we really need to remember, especially coming into this current period of sort of economic uncertainty, where we think the government can just pull some levers and the world will be better. Actually, we know already from the Provincial Growth Fund that even if you've got $3 billion to spend right now, you can't spend it right now. Or you probably shouldn't spend it right now. What you should be doing is taking your time, working out what's the best spend, how can we leverage this to get employment growth or to make healthy communities better. And so it's kind of, I look back and I kind of think, have we forgotten that lesson already? And I think as we move into this period where, we've got this virus happening right now and everybody's like, hey, we need to spend money, we need to wage subsidies, we need this, we need that. And if we just pull the right levers, the government's going to smooth everything over. Well, actually, no, it's just not going to be possible. The Provincial Growth Fund illustrates this. To build a road, for example, can take a year's worth of planning before you even start digging in the ground, and that's a lesson that we need to learn. And so I think
like time limited spending will inevitably prioritize things that are ready to go right now. I just think if someone gave me $100,000 and said you need to, go to your Onehunga community and say, hey, I want to improve Onehunga, let's spend this, and it's got to be spent in the next year.
Well, in the next 24 hours.
Yeah, like and who would I go to? Like what problems are, I know some of the problems in the area, but I don't necessarily know the ones that are the long-term drivers of inequality, or, what are the things that, and sometimes they're going to be surprising things.
And so the other side of this actually is, if you spend that money unwisely, if you waste that money, if it's seen as being too political, you're effectively burning up the social capital around that. So people are like, hey, Provincial Growth Fund, good idea, maybe we should do that. Oh, but actually it's just being wasted. Oh, now I don't want that, and I don't want to take a risk anymore.
And we don't want our government to be spending money in the regions because it's always going to be wasted.
Yeah, and so you really need to start thinking about the long term and pulling it that way right from the start. It's so important because there's a window of opportunity for these things, and if you spend it on the wrong thing, people just say, well, we don't want that again. I do think there is some hope. Some of the more recent announcements that have come out and some of the way that those plans have been developed, you do see local communities starting to cooperate together in a number of regions where, any number of little local councils have got together to say, hey, here's our sort of region-wide strategy. And so all of this takes time. So you saw the previous government, for example, developing these growth plans for the regions, a great initiative, but they were created in a vacuum. It wasn't like the government was saying, here's $3 billion, go away and create a growth plan for your region. It was, hey, money's not really on the table, go away and think about how you want to develop as a region.
If we were going to be offering you money.
Well, no, they didn't even say that, right? It was basically just go away and think about how you could create growth for your community. Right. Wonderful plan. But when the next government comes along and says, well, we've got $3 billion to spend, it wasn't just a case of pulling up this plan that was built a year ago, because that plan was built without money on the table. It was sort
like,
of
what will you do if you have nothing?
Yeah, as opposed to, hey, actually, if we were going to help you and you were going to co-fund, what might you create? And that's quite a different discussion to have. And so it has taken, 2 years for some of these communities just to repurpose their thinking and to say, if there was a little bit of money on the table, if the government was going to pony up $500,000 and we were going to pony up $500,000, what would we create? That's quite different to saying we've only got $500,000 that we can get together ourselves.
And if we were going to get together with the two councils that
Yes.
sort of border us, and because we all are in an area that has a particular climate that's good for growing this sort of stuff. I remember your example about almost all of the regional growth plans, or the plans that were in existence, talked about Manuka honey, and like, oh, we could leverage Manuka honey. And it's just like, well, how many of those, you can't fund everyone to become the expert in New Zealand about Manuka honey.
Well, and we're going to have a Manuka Honey Research Centre, and someone else is going to have a Manuka Honey Research Centre, and another place will have a Manuka Honey Research Centre. And it's that sort of notion of actually, how do you cooperate together to create something with spillovers?
And some difficult decisions obviously need to be made, but then the central government has a role in going, oh, we have 5 councils coming to us with a plan that says they're going to have a Manuka Honey Research Centre. We're only going to fund one. But how can we make sure that all of those regions actually have links into that so that they can leverage what's already going on?
Well, it's the same argument. We'll go back to the pools with the schools, right? You get 5 schools saying we're going to have a school pool. Actually, there is a coordination role here where someone has to say, oh, we've noticed that the 5 of you are going to have a pool each. Well, how about if one of you or something else has one really great pool that does all 5 of you, and we spend half the money but get twice the outcome.
And make sure it's designed and situated on the property in such a way that it's easily accessed without disrupting the operations of the school, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, that's that coordination and cooperation that can come from working together, from pooling funding. Yeah, it makes sense to me. Yeah.
I think that that's a really good spot to work onto your most recent paper, because some of the stuff that comes out whenever you start talking about migration, you'll hear people go, oh, why don't we just, if the regions are dying, why don't we just get all the migrants that are currently sort of stuffing up pressing and stressing the infrastructure in Auckland, say, and causing a housing crisis, why don't we just say you can't move to New Zealand unless you're willing to move to the regions? And I know that you sort of started talking a little bit about that and actually saying how that some of that could be possible as a lever that regional towns can pull, but then moving through into talking about how you got into your most recent paper, A Welcome That Works.
Yeah, I guess it's probably good to step back a bit, because as soon as you start talking about regional stagnation and decline when it comes to population growth, the immediate policy lever that comes to mind is migration. Can't we just open the tap and let some migrants in? It kind of makes sense at one. It's intuitive at one level, and in certain countries, this is their entire policy. So you do see America, for example, saying we don't have a problem here, because as long as there's somewhere in the world where people are young, we can just open up the border and let some in, and we'll probably open that up to young, healthy, and skilled people, even better. So at one level, there's an analysis of, does this work for New Zealand? And here I leaned heavily on Natalie Jackson's work, for example. Basically, no, this is not going to work for New Zealand. If it was going to work for New Zealand, you'd be looking at a population of around 60 million people in New Zealand. And that then, that begs a whole lot of other questions, right? So there's a whole lot of other questions. If we're going to try and wash ourselves of population stagnation and decline, the numbers of people we would have to literally invite to New Zealand is just enormous. And even then, Natalie Jackson argues you wouldn't be getting rid of the ageing population. You would be solving the birthing thing. And the interesting analysis there is that once someone comes to New Zealand, while, in their country overseas, they might have a fertility rate of 4 or something like that, which, every family has 4 kids. They come to New Zealand, typically within 1 or 2 generations, they've reverted to New Zealand's fertility rate. It's a phenomenon that happens and is replicated in any number of countries around the world. That, as someone becomes a New Zealander, they take on more of the attributes of what living here looks like, and part of that is the fertility rate that we have. We can't solve this at a national level with migration. That's just sort of something that's off the table. But there is, once again, this sort of local solutions for local problems. There is a way in which a community might say, hey, but we want migration to be part of our solution. It's not going to work everywhere, but potentially it could work here. And it will make us look different. We will have a different community than now. But it should be on the table for a local community. Once again, however, it's probably not going to look like what you think it looks like. So, there is, and I would go so far as to say it's sort of the common statement, well, yeah, we can just make all the migrants move to Gore.
And tell them they can't leave.
Yeah, like, well, I don't know, you'd put a fence around the town or something. It's like the wall to keep the migrants in. It's just it's sort of this crazy, unthought through solution. It turns out that migrants are just as intelligent as everyone else. And there's a reason why they want to live in Auckland, and it's the same reasons that lots of New Zealanders want to live in Auckland. There's the amenities there. It's a fantastic place to live.
It's a global node.
We hope it's a global node. And there's a reason why lots of people want to go and live in Sydney for the same reason, right? Because that is the global regional, maybe Melbourne. But there's a sort of a fundamental piece of the picture here that we need to take account of. Is how do you attract people to stay in a place that's not a node?
Part of your work in that was looking at an example of a town in Canada called Morden. Can you just talk about what they've done?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting example, and it is an example which has both positives and negatives, but let's emphasise the positives at the moment. Morden's a little town. It's 40,000 people, I think. So it's not a huge city.
Do you know where is it in Canada?
Oh, I would have to go and look at another map. It's not one of the big centres, right? You're talking about a smaller place. So Canada has this thing called a provincial nomination scheme or program. Basically what it does is says, hey, here's our minimum standards for people that we want to shift to Canada.
Like a point system.
Kind of like, yeah, the Canadian system's very similar to New Zealand in that respect. And they're oversubscribed, just like New Zealand. Like there's this huge amount of people that meet the minimum standards. So how do you decide, of all the people that you've got in this pool, how do you decide who to offer a place to? And what you see in Canada is them saying, well, why don't the provinces start to nominate some people and help us to filter this great pool of people by, someone is now in your little place. If you're happy with them and they want to live there, then you can say, hey, put these people at the front of the queue, and they can help you through that national program, kind of fast track you through the application process. And what that does is it gives the local community a bit of voice. And actually, of all the people that we've got that could move here, we've got this family, they want to live in our little town. It's a great fit. They're working here, they're paying their taxes, we trust them, and then they've expressed an interest and they do want to live here. Well, why not let that person get to the front of the queue?
And there's also measures and kind of rules around how they determine people who are overseas and want to apply to move there. And can you talk about kind of those?
Yeah, so part of it is they will invite you to come and visit, and they'll help pay that a little, and say, well, if you're really interested in moving here, come and see if it's a good fit. Come and live with us for a week, and you can meet employers in town. We can talk about your family and their needs and things like that. They apply they've got their own centre of gravity test. So, for example, if you have a relative living somewhere else in Canada, you can't fit under their scheme because they know that families want to be together, and if you've got a family in a big city and you're coming in, you're highly likely to move to be with them in the end. So they are looking for people without connections somewhere else in Canada, and
so that they will be their strongest connection.
They will be the connection, yeah, and then the family members will come and join them. So that's a simple way of sort of filtering and saying, hey, we want you to be part of our community, and we're expecting you to commit to us, and part of that is building your centre of gravity here.
And that sense of commitment was really behind a lot of what was in your most recent paper, A Welcome That Works, talking about welcoming policy. Can you kind of talk about, that sort of sense of, obviously our most recent paper talked about temporary migration and the fact that New Zealand has this big over-reliance on the temporary migration lever of, someone coming here to work, but it's sort of mandated that they're only here to work for a certain amount of time, and there's no real expectation that they will have a pathway to permanence after that. And actually going that's really not a good recipe for having people come to New Zealand and actually investing in the communities that they're living in, because they know that there's a time limit to that. And so what are the kind of changes that you've recommended that we make to our migration policy so that we have this sort of more of a social cohesion with people who come to work and live here?
So a huge topic. I think to start this discussion off, I think we sort of need to once again take a step back and say, let's look at welcoming policy. What you hear people say is people need to invest in us, or in actual fact, we need to flip that on its head and say we need to invest in the people in our midst. And so welcoming policy sort of flips that matrix on its head and says we're not expecting these people to just become New Zealanders. We're expecting to help them become New Zealanders. Whatever that means, and that definition will change over time. But I think there is a sort of a notion in welcoming policy that says, you can have the best settlement programs in the world. You can have all these fancy things where you're focusing on helping a migrant to become a New Zealander. But if the community that they're entering into is not a welcoming community, it's not going to work. And that's a sort of a classic situation where over time someone moves into your community and they'll either feel welcomed or they won't. And who makes them feel welcome? Well, the people who are already in that community. The first thing that welcoming policy does is it basically flips that settlement matrix on its head and says the onus is not on this person to feel welcome. The onus is on us to make someone feel welcome. If we really want someone to reside and live in our local community, the onus is on us to make them feel welcome. There won't be 100%. It's not going to be perfect, right? There will always be people that come and go.
There's always going to be people who are xenophobic, and you can't really, excise that completely from your community.
Yeah. But there is this, with welcoming policy, really is this focus on the long term, which goes back to what are we trying to solve? We're trying to solve this long-term population sort of issue. The way we've tended to do it recently, I would say for the last 15, 20 years, is through short-term fixes. So when you look at migration statistics and you say, well, we've got all these people coming to live in New Zealand, and you talk about Stats New Zealand, it's 90,000 or 70,000. It's come back from its peak at 90 back to 70,000. 70,000, such a huge number of people coming to reside in our country. And in actual fact, all of those numbers are all really fudgy, because when you look at the number of permanent residents that we create every year, the permanent resident visas, there's only about 40,000 to 50,000. It's not this lolly scramble where anyone can come here and get a permanent residence visa. But what we have done is created this other thing called a temporary visa. And this temporary visa is one where we've got this labour market pressure. We can't find people to pick apples. We can't find people to cut down trees or to plant trees specifically. So we say, well, let's just have a temporary visa. And this can be for 1 year up to 5 years actually. And some people actually I've saw in the press one person up to 9 years on temporary visas.
Wow.
Where there is no expectation that this visa will be renewed. It's like you are basically here at the behest of...
So are they reapplying every year?
Well, it depends. Sometimes it's a 2-year or 3-year or 4-year and they get a renewal for another year, and it's a bit messy. I mean, I lived for 11 years on a yearly visa renewal in China, where every year it was like, am I going to get a visa for another year? You can't invest long-term in a community when you're afraid that you're just going to be kicked out in a year's time. You are living there, but you are not investing in the same way. Those expectations of how long will I be here for are really important when it comes to, do I get on the school board? Do I invest in this community in the same way? And you see it in Australia, there's evidence from Australia, there's evidence from the UK or Canada specifically, where we do look at, or researchers look at, the amount of investment that the community gives a migrant. This one case study of school teachers in rural Queensland actually was saying if the community knew that the school teacher was only going to be here for 2 years, they just didn't bother investing in that person. They're like, well, why would we bother to get to know them? Why would we bother to invite them to a pub on a Friday night and get to know their family? Because they're just going to leave anyway. And you see the same thing happening on the migrants' end. And this is more evidence from Canada, where someone says, hey, I'm just not going to be here long term. So, I'll be here, I'll pay my taxes, but I'm not going to care about community issues.
Or even to the extent of I'm not really going to invest a huge amount in necessarily learning the language to a really high level, because I'm not going to need it.
Yeah, well, why? So let's. I love to go to the extreme sometimes, but why? Māori language is a vital part of of who we are. Yeah. But why would someone who's only here for 2 years start to learn Māori, for example? It's just not one of those considerations that you'd be thinking through. But if you're thinking about, living here long term, then yeah, you might. And you'd say, actually, I think that's valuable for understanding this country and understanding, I want my children to. And so you can imagine a school that's saying, how much emphasis do we place on learning Māori? If all the parents are saying yes, 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 then there's a greater impetus for that community to learn. Whereas if you've got a whole lot of parents there who are only committed here for a couple of years, they're like, well, that's just a waste of time. Like, my kids aren't going to need that in the future. Let's work in the opposite direction and say, no, don't do that. So there is this, I think, if we focus on the long term, you start to get different solutions. While we focus on this Band-Aid solution of, let's have temporary visas, it's not serving us for the long term well.
So part of what we advocated for in your paper is for a freeze on the current number of temporary visas that we're offering, actually opening up pathways to permanence. And if there are workers that, let's say a company is like, a business is saying, hey, I really love this person. They are doing such an amazing job. I want to make it possible for them to actually live here and do this job. And perhaps that starts messing around with the point system in terms of, maybe that job isn't necessarily a super high skill or high wage job, but I guess you had a conversation, I remember you telling me about, with someone where they talked about, we either buy it or we build it. So can you describe the difference between those two approaches and how we might, which you think we need to do?
So it was interesting because we put the paper out for academic review, and you immediately had two kind of camps coming back, and one was saying we just need to stop all migration, and the other one was, no, we need more of this. And it's this interesting argument around buy it or build it. Do we build the skills we have, or do we
within the people that we already have?
Yeah. Or do we import the skills? And in actual fact, I think it's a measure of both. Like, someone asked me, should we just stop all temporary migration? I'm like, no, actually, there is a form of temporary migration which is healthy and beneficial for New Zealand, and it's actually beneficial for the people that are here. So some people, all they're interested in is being here for 2 years. All they want to do is earn more money than they could back somewhere else, and they want to help their family somewhere else, and it's actually something that's useful for New Zealand as well.
Well, it's kind of like the OE in London, how many of my friends went over to basically earn enough to buy a house back here and then move back.
Yeah. there is a point at which there's a tipping point, I think, where the flavour of that does a disservice for the country. And so I would say, hey, I think we're at a point now where I would say enough is enough. Let's just say, hey, we've got 170,000 people now in the country on any one day on a temporary work visa. Let's just say, well, let's just put a lid on it there and say that's the max we're going to have. And if there's industries and locations which I think are now, and I think there's evidence to support this, that are becoming dependent on temporary work visas as a sort of a low-wage, low-skill solution to labour market pressures, I think we need to start applying some pressure there and saying, hey, maybe this isn't in the best interest of New Zealand in the long term.
For you to keep working the same way that you have been working for
to
the
just
last
to keep
decades.
churning through workers, we'll just, this easy, cheap solution is low-wage workers from overseas. Talked about this. A lot of these workers are vulnerable on multiple points. They don't know local laws and legislation. They don't have the labour inspector on speed dial if something goes wrong. They don't know, for example, that the employer shouldn't take your passport away. And effectively, there's a notion of I would go so far as in some cases abuse going on, where we need to rethink that solution. Most employers are not in that category. We're not talking about every employer is bad at all, and that's why I think there is a place in New Zealand for temporary migration.
But the way the system's currently done is that it leaves room for bad actors to actually abuse people.
Well, I mean, and this is part of how I view the world, that actually, we need to enforce minimum standards. If we as collectively as a society has said that this is where we stand in regards to, people should get their wages on time, and they should at least get this much per hour, then we need to be enforcing that. And it would be really interesting, I haven't done it, but it would be interesting to go away and see how much money the government is spending on enforcement, because we have seen this massive rise in temporary migration. And if there hasn't sort of been a massive rise in the money spent on enforcement, then you can say, well, what's going on here? Actually, we're setting some people up to fail. I mean, equally, I think there are labour market pressures out there. These are long-term pressures where, if you go into some places and you go and have a meal and you wait forever because there's just not the the waiters or the waitresses around to bring you your food. You talk to the employer there and they're like, I can't get the people that I need. Or when they do get someone, they can't stay here long term. And so this is something that I think I think it's a really interesting matrix, because sometimes these people don't fit what a Wellington official thinks is the best person to be living in New Zealand long term. But actually they're in our communities already. They're living there. They want to stay. They're happy to be here. They think that's a wonderful place to live. But we've placed this really high benchmark for them to be living here long term. And so I do think this is what sort of brings me back to Morden a little bit. If there is someone in your community that's been living and working there, they want to reside there, and they're close, but they're not quite there. Surely a local community can say, well, actually, this is the person I want. Let's give them 5 extra points. Is 5 extra points the make or break? Sometimes it might be. And maybe there should be more local voice in that point system to say, because they want to live in our community, because they are here, because they have invested, because their kids are learning Māori, because this is a good fit, there should be some recognition of that. And that's a sort of a quid pro quo for being a welcoming community. Being welcoming costs money, and there should be some sort of benefits that come along with that. Because lots of communities will say, hey, this is not for us. We don't actually want to use this solution. We're not interested in being welcoming. We'll try other things. For a community to be welcoming, actually, it's going to take an investment. And so one of the payoffs for that investment would be when you do get people, the government saying, well, is this person in a healthy community? Yes. Is this community welcoming them well? Yes. So maybe they should get some points recognition for that.
We're out of time. If you want to read a bit more about Julian's papers, the recommendations including offering civics courses and even down to offering scholarships for kids of migrants to be in sports on Saturdays, which is a nice little surprising one that I really enjoyed. You can find Julian's work on our website just under the economics tab at maxim.org.nz. Julian, the way we finish off this is always by asking our interviewee, our guest, what are they reading at the moment? So I know that you have quite a wide range of interests. So what have you been reading lately, Julian?
I am actually quite a sci-fi fantasy kind of guy. So I won't bore you with that.
Oh,
so,
no, please.
No, I can't. A little bit like Gimli the dwarf, I like a good an axe fight. But I would say if you want something that is going to really push you forward and test your resolve, but also is quite hilarious, and I would say that truthfully, I've been in fits and giggles every now and then, is Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution, which I would actually recast as Edmund Burke's Rants and Ravages on the Revolution. It's this interesting place to start. So, I would say go for that. I don't think you're going to get, it's not a book you're going to read in a night. And in fact, if you're going to attempt it, just like lots of things in life, maybe check out the wiki page first.
To get the context.
Yeah, to get the context, to get a bit of the history, a useful starting point that then enables you to access. I mean, it's written a long time ago. The language is difficult.
But what are you getting out of it?
Oh, I would say...
other than laughs?
Yeah, I mean, actually quite a lot of fits and giggles. But I think also just this notion, I mean, there's a really interesting comment, for example, on innovation. And innovation is something that, as an economist, I am sort of all the time we're talking about productivity and how New Zealand can be more innovative. And Edmund Burke has this wonderful quote where he basically says, if all you can see is innovation, you've basically got this small mind. And it's just so countercultural to what we are seeing today. Just this really interesting take on the world that is quite, it does have a lot of revelation into who we are in society. So go for it.
That's great. All right, well, if you'd like to hear more from us and keep up with the rest of our research and analysis of politics and policy in New Zealand, you can sign up on the homepage of our website to get our monthly forum email and invitations to future Maxim Institute events. You can also follow us on Facebook and check out videos on our YouTube channel. Just search Maxim Institute on any of those platforms. But from me and Julian, thanks for listening to the Maxim Institute podcast this month. You can search and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever else you get your podcasts. From all of us at Maxim, mā te wā, goodbye for now.